analytics is our deep dive topic for the week. First of all, I did a lot of research. I'd like to touch on my sources. I went to the Ringer. I read the Operations and Research on Football paper published by Virgil Carter and Robert E. McCall, a Samford University article, and a few Sports Illustrated articles. Before we get started, I think it's very important, before we talk about in-game analytics, to explain what are analytics. My definition that I have, correct me if you have any other differing opinion, analytics is the process of discovering, interpreting, and communicating significant patterns in data. Quite simply, analytics helps us see insights and meaningful data that we might otherwise not detect. And they help us determine what is the most mathematically correct option to select.
Right. It's all about decision making, right? Is using, instead of experience or using gut feel or maybe advisors, it's using raw data and applying it in such a way that you think will improve your decision making abilities in different situations.
And then I think the most important thing to cover next is, how can analytics help us? What can we use this data to help us look at? And there's many ways. And some examples would be things like going for it on fourth down, going for 2 points after a touchdown. An interesting one I read about, defensive linemen run more from the bench to the field than they do in actual gameplay. There's something we can touch on there later. Running plays to the long side of the field. The use of computer chips and pads and the tracking how fast players run, all that kind of stuff. All kinds of things, but I'm not going to take the floor on all of this. I kind of got us started. I'll let you roll into what you have written down.
Right. So for me, analytics is sort of used in conjunction, right? You can never use it by itself, using data to drive your decision making. The risk with using data to drive your decision making, anything, not just football, is if your data is bad or your model is bad, your decision is bad, right? Garbage in, garbage out is how that's commonly referred to. So give you an example, right? Going back a while, let's say, Derek, let's use Derrick Henry in Tennessee. Usually this happens with teams that have a good running back. The Titans win 80% of the games that Derrick Henry runs the ball 30 times. All right, so let's fast forward to a game and Tennessee's down 25-14 with 2 minutes to go, but Derrick Henry only has 27 carries. All right, well, the best thing for them to do is to get Derrick Henry the ball 3 times, right? No, of course not. The best thing to do is to try and score quickly, throwing the ball deep down the field. So that's kind of a careful application of the data to understand, hey, it's not just a snapshot of information and then trying to apply it to a game. There's some interpretation and modeling that has to occur. I think for me, when I look at data and decisions, I think more of overarching strategy. I know you and maybe other people think of maybe individual discrete decision-making points. So when I think of data, data analysis and overarching strategy, I like to think of what I call momentum management, right? Momentum in a game, we feel it, we see it, is when the tide shifts back and forth between different teams and different situations throughout the natural flow of the game. I think that human element of momentum has to be managed, and you can use that doing data and analytics to determine, the best plays and best situations and best strategies to use when you have momentum, when you don't have it, or when momentum is kind of neutral. For example, if you have momentum, that's when you execute your game plan. That's when you run your plays. That's where if you have a good 4th and 2 play and you get to the 4th and 2, you run it. If you have a good 2-point play, maybe that's when you run it. You have a good fake punt, that's when you run it, right? If momentum's against you, hey, that's when it's time to be aggressive, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you go away from your game plan, but it means, hey, turn up the notch. Let's say, instead of thinking, well, maybe in the best situation to do in this is to just run the ball up the middle and try and get a first down. No, play action, go over the top, or vice versa. If the best decision is, to be in a soft coverage, no, blitz, right? So you want to kind of manage the momentum there from that perspective if it's against you. If it's neutral, that's where I say you tend conservative, right? That's say you don't go for 2, right? If it's kind of a back and forth slow game, you don't really know, both teams still haven't been able to separate. look, why go for two and potentially risk losing you momentum, right? Because at that point, you're just trying to protect yourself and wait for your opportunity to pounce. So that's how I view it, right? I kind of juggle the human side of it, the momentum side, and the data side to learn how to best take advantage of that momentum. Because it gets to a point where eventually the human beings, the players, have to make the plays, right? You
Absolutely,
can,
yeah. We're
you
not
can have all
computers.
the, yeah, you can have all the best data in the world, but eventually someone's got to catch the ball. Someone's got to block that pass rusher. Someone's got to, tackle the quarterback or knock down the pass. Eventually someone has to make the play. And I think that's juggling. That is what coaches have to be really keen on doing here. I know you've got some thoughts. What do you have?
Well, and touching on some examples of how this can be used in this kind of touch. Yes, there's a lot more of individual stats I was focusing on, but those stats help you do your overarching theme. Like some things I saw are stats comparing things saying that pass coverage is far more important on defense than pass rush, because pass rush can be, they can scheme against pass rush. You know what I mean? You can have guys chipping, you can have guys blocking. So pass coverage is much harder to out scheme than pass rush is. Giving up the ball with a punt for better defensive field position is far less valuable than the chance to retain the football. And we think, oh, obviously that's correct. But like we say, it really shows you gain so much more by going for it on maybe 4th and 5 and converting than you would by punting it and pinning them on the 10. There's just if you have any gumption that you could make it, it really, really shows that that's the best decision to go for. And another statistical thing, and then I'll go into more of the some history that I read. But another thing I thought was very interesting is the archaic mindset of focusing on third downs. Every team's judged by, they're 10 of 12 on third downs, or X of Y on 3rd or 4th down, and this is a stat that we all have fixated on in the past. I was reading some data, and it says it is much more important to track how much yardage or success is gained on 1st and 2nd downs than it is for 3rd downs. For instance, focus more on picking up long passing plays on 1st down gives you much more success than running the ball twice on 1st and 2nd down and then trying to convert on 3rd down. If you can get the majority of your yardage in the 1st down, it sets you up for so much more success than it would be waiting to try to convert it at the end of that down. 1st and 2nd downs are very crucial because 2nd and short is much easier to convert than 3rd and short. You know what I mean? So this advocates more for taking shots down the field on 1st down and 2nd down. Analytics also show pass efficiency is much more important than yards per carry on running. So be that as it may, this analytics is great, but football hasn't always been about analytics. And I kind of wanted to get into a little bit about how analytics kind of started, who started it, how is it developed, and then how is it being used today. And maybe we can even get in a little bit to who's using it the best and who's not using it, and does that show? So, the analytical revolution in the NFL, I don't know if you knew this or not, from my research, it started somewhere around 1971. And this was the publishing of an academic paper titled Operations Research on Football. Who was this written by? Virgil Carter, who at the time was a backup quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals. This was also the quarterback that was put into place. He was the backup. I can't remember who the starter was. The starter went down. He goes in, and this is when Bill Walsh's West Coast offense was invented. Virgil Carter did not have the strongest arm, so Walsh devised a scheme to do more short-range, quick passes to accentuate his skill set that he did have, which is just kind of like a fun fact and almost a precursor that Bill Walsh was really whether he realized it or not, one of the guys to really focus on analytical thinking rather than old school thinking. He was way far ahead of his time in what he did. But Virgil Carter published this paper with Roger Matchall, I believe. I could be pronouncing it wrong. I'm sorry if I did, Robert. I know you're listening. Who was a systems engineer. And the culmination of all this data, they gathered play-by-play data from all NFL teams at the time, except one. The Raiders would not give them their data. And this was not widely available for people at the time. So from that year, they gathered all the play-by-play data, which was 8,373 plays, and there was also a litany of variables that was pumped into their data source, such as down and distance on those plays, what was the score at the time, even so far as what was the temperature outside in the play. And all of these things, they compiled the data to find trends, to see, what can we learn from all of this. And we spoke about the Raiders, and I thought it was funny because in my later research, I found, even still today, John Gruden was one of the coaches who kind of bucks the system on analytics, and he still wants to be more of an old school coach. But so all of this compilation of data, they didn't necessarily use it into the best of its ability, but what they did do was they started thinking about it. And what I read basically was once they compiled this data, they brought it to coaches around the league, and they're like, hey, or front office, and hey, look at this. We need to go for it more on fourth downs. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. That seems crazy. But then the next iteration of all of this, Chip Kelly kind of was a big analytical guy. It didn't really work out for him too much. But the next evolution in that was the 2014 Philadelphia Eagles and Doug Peterson were really some of the people who started aggressively backing analytics. I believe you remember, they would go for it on fourth down all the time, especially in the Super Bowl run, and they would go for two all the time. They were the ones who really started just going for two all the time, and it worked out for them. And all of this coincided with another data gathering process we're all familiar with, Zebra Technologies and their competitor now Catapult. They used RFID technology in stadiums and on players' shoulder pads to gather all of this information. They were the first team to adopt this tech, and now widely, I think everyone pretty much uses it, but they were the first team to gather this tech, and that company paired with this little group that we may have heard about called Amazon Web Services, and they form Next Gen Stats, and with these, they all compiled all the data to come up with all these variables teams looked at, like fastest ball carriers, longest plays, fastest sacks, longest tackles, improbable completions, and incredible yards after a catch. I have more, but I'm going to stop because I'm dominating the conversation. I've spit out a bunch of information. What do you think about all of this? Do you remember any of this happening, or did you know any of these things?
Yeah, so Bill Walsh and I grew up next to each other in the 1950s in California. So I know, no, I'm kidding. Yeah, so obviously Walsh in Cincinnati with Paul Brown, they were an expansion franchise, right? So they had to get creative. And like any, like they say, necessity is the mother of invention. So that's where Walsh started thinking about these principles. He had Ken Anderson, who was not a strong arm guy to begin with. And then obviously they lose him, like you mentioned, and they had to go to Virgil Carter, who was even less stronger arm. I think it all, like the data part is all important and valuable, right? But it comes down to also, you have to have the right players, right? Philly didn't win the Super Bowl because they had an analytical process. They won the Super Bowl because they had more talented players and their analytics gave them a slight edge. So it's all figuring out what your edge is, right? If you think you can be more aggressive on fourth down, and that gives you an edge over your opponents, then that's fantastic. Because you have to think of a way to be different. How are you different than everybody else, right? I think this is something that New England was famously do, right? On defense, if a 3-4 defense, 3 down defensive linemen and 4 linebackers was popular, they switched to what's called a 4-3 defense, which is 4 defensive linemen with, down and 3 linebackers, right? Their whole point is just to be different, to give teams something different to think about and a different approach and kind of mess with the game flow of other teams. New England would have a left-footed punter, for example, just anything to be a little different. Now, like you mentioned with Chip Kelly, he had a lot of analytical approaches that did not work for him in the NFL at all. He was fired from Philadelphia and then fired from San Francisco not long after that. So I think it still hinges on the talent side. I think that matters a lot. I don't think it's necessarily, when it comes to data, I don't think it's necessarily about, using data means you're going to win or improve better. I think it's figuring out how you can be different in the same way that a defensive coordinator or offensive coordinator tries to think of a game plan to take advantage of weaknesses in a different way to attack an opposing team. I think analytics allows you to think of different ways to do some of the same. It's like, okay, we know we like our matchups on 4th down or on 5 yards and in plays, 3rd and 5, 2nd and 5, 4th and 5. So guess what? We're going to go for it a lot on 4th down and 5 and less because we like those matchups, and based on understanding, hey, and guess what? We've also got data saying that going on 4th down, going for it on 4th down is a good decision in a lot of ways, supporting your win probabilities and things like that you mentioned. It kind of helps reinforce that, right? So it comes down to, beginning in, it comes down to players and coaches. You have to have a good game plan and you have to have good players. In the end, if you don't have that, it doesn't matter. But what analytical approaches can do is look for you to find different ways to go about it. So the famous way that a lot of people have heard about is the Moneyball approach in baseball with Oakland Athletics.
Yes.
So one of the big statements that happened during that event in the early 2000s is they lost a superstar. I believe it was Johnny Damon or Jason. It was Jason Giambi, actually. I'm sorry. And they were looking to replace him. And the scouting department says, well, how do we draft another Jason Giambi? It's like, we don't have to draft another Jason Giambi. We just have to find 3 players that get the level of production of a Jason Giambi, so, instead of paying $50 million for Giambi and $5 million for 2 other backup players, let's play $15 million, $15 million, $15 million for 3 players that in aggregate get that level of production. So again, it's just a different way of thinking, a different level of approach. You still need good players. You still need players to produce. But instead of worrying so much about, well, we either have Patrick Mahomes or we just won't win a Super Bowl. Or if we don't have Aaron Rodgers, we stink, or we don't have Brady or whoever, we don't have Aaron Donald, pick a superstar, go about it maybe a different way. And you can use analytics and data, especially in games, to look for different ways to use the players you have to overcome some of those deficiencies and to accentuate your strengths. And that's sort of what it comes down to, is looking at games from a different perspective, not just going on gut feel and seeing if you can, out execute a team if the team's better than you, at traditional ways, looking at things differently, applying things differently. And I think that's what the best way of using this data analytics allows teams to do.
And as far off as it may seem that we are, that is exactly what my conclusion is all about. So in conclusion, analytics, as we have said, are a deep and wide source of information, vast source of information, and cannot give you the exact formula on how to win games. But what they can do is help remove some of the human error from an equation, and it can help reassure you on which decisions are the most beneficial ones to make. And although when you make a decision, the human element of the players can change the outcome, you know that statistically the call was right. The call was the right call to make, but maybe your player is the anomaly in the equation, did not execute the call correctly. And also, it can help show you more of the things. It narrows your vision down, and it shows you what you need. It can help you tune out the things you don't need to look at and help you look at the things that are most important in game planning and aiding your decision process. And I think something we're going to get in later on down the road, possibly after the season this year, is analytics plays a huge part in the draft process, and there's so much more that we can get into on that, and I'm very excited about talking about that and the scouting process, but there's so much more to the whole thing, and I think we're kind of on the same page so to speak, on what is analytics are used for.
Right. And I think my final point, I think you hit on something big there, is that there is so much action and activity going on in game. You have to manage personalities, players, injuries, refs, the other team, adjustments, but all these are all things coaches have to do, and they have to do it instantaneously, essentially, and then call the next play right away. They have to react immediately and start over with the next play, next sequence of downs. So what using some analytics and some data-driven decision-making can do is it can remove some of the workload and remove some of the thinking, right? It's almost like an assembly line where the workers don't have to think and figure out as much. They just have to do their tasks, right? They're just, okay, my job is to just put on this panel and screw it in, and then put on the next panel and screw it in. If you have data-driven decision-making, then okay, I know I have to focus on, to beat this team, I have to focus on these 5 things. I can't focus on these other 5 things. So I'm going to use the data-driven decision model to come up with, all of my decisions and those 5 things that I don't think are as important, and let me focusing on things that are. I think that right there is the future and the best way to use the data. And I think teams that are successful using analytics, I think that's how they do it. I think they use the data, they delegate the data. That's what I'm going to use. Data delegation. That's a new buzzword for you. To tasks that aren't as important, that allows them to focus on the in-game activities that are.
I absolutely agree. And I think finally, to end off this segment, which I think is one of our best deep dives we've done so far, I'd like to touch on the top 5 teams who do use data analysis and the top 5 teams who don't, to see if we can contract our own opinions, our own data, so to speak, if it's working, if data is the truth. So first off, let's look at the top 5 teams who do use data analysis. In number 5, there is a tie, San Francisco 49ers and the Buffalo Bills. Tied for 4th, so that's 2 teams right there. I'd say pretty good overall. Yeah. In sole possession of 3rd place, the Philadelphia Eagles, and it makes sense, even coming from the Chip Kelly era where they started to look into data analysis. That's helped them carry over into the Peterson era, which eventually won them a Super Bowl. So obviously that was successful. Next up has been the Cleveland Browns. They've gone from being the worst team in the NFL to a pretty scary team from time to time. They haven't completed the cycle yet, but they're getting there. So I see steady improvement. And lastly, at number 1, the Baltimore Ravens are the number 1 team as far as analytic-based approach through this survey of teams that have said which teams use the most analytics. So what do you think on those?
Yeah, so I think, as with any survey, it's interesting to see what the criteria is. I think when you look at the teams that are the best teams in the NFL right now, or have been the last few years, it's interesting not to see New England at the top of that list, right? Because everyone thinks of Belichick as being this great, really logical, rational thinker. And I think his combination of using some data and some just gut feel and experience is one of the reasons why the Patriots have been successful.
They're
but you
tied
can't deny
for 8th.
Okay, so they're not too far off. But yeah, I think it's not too big of a surprise. I think one of the things that I think is very interesting about that list, right? You look at Baltimore, Cleveland, San Francisco, Buffalo to a lesser degree, and Philly, right? What is something that all those teams have in common? They have mobile quarterbacks.
Yeah.
So
That's
I think
very true.
When you have a mobile quarterback, I think that opens up the offense a little bit more, and it maybe thinks kind of expands your thinking and game planning a little bit, and thinking, if I got a guy that can get outside the pocket or run for a first down, maybe that allows me to think more about going for it on 4th down or going for 2, because it basically is an extra guy. So and I think that's a credit to those teams for understanding that, right? To understand, hey, I've got a guy who can move. I want to take advantage of that by thinking more about going for it on 4th down, going for 2 and things like that, because I've got a quarterback who's a good athlete who can make plays with his legs as well as his arm. I don't want to hamstring him by forcing him to get just 1 shot to get a first down on 3rd down. I want to give him 2 shots because he's that good of an athlete. So I think it's that combination. It's understanding who you got and then figuring out how to apply it. I think that's very interesting.
And to finish this segment off, let's look at the teams who don't use analytics. Starting from, I guess, the 5th spot, which is the team who would use the most out of this, but so they're fifth to last. Pittsburgh Steelers, old school organization. You kind of see it how they play. They're ailing lately. They've been in a decline. Maybe the analytics tell them to move on from Big Ben, but they're not listening to it. Tied for third, New York Giants and Cincinnati Bengals. Two teams, one is getting better, one is bad. Do analytics show they maybe need to follow it more? In second place, odd one in the trend, Tennessee Titans. I don't know. We can maybe discuss a little bit about what that says. And finally, the team who uses the least amount of analytics, Washington Football Team.
Yeah, so there's a couple themes there, right? Is you look at teams like the Giants and Cincinnati, they're better this year, but they've been bad for a really, really, really long time. And these are teams that have been bad, and there's really no excuse to not turn to some data-driven approach. And you can throw Washington in this too, right? Where it's like, look, you haven't scouted well. You haven't had good coaches and game plan. You haven't been great. You don't have a great level of talent. So you guys, you have no excuse. They're not thinking differently, right? They're just saying, we're going to roll out the football and see if we can beat you with our talent and our coaching. Well, they can't. The last decade or so has shown that for those franchises. So I think that's kind of an indication of the organization. Like you said, old school, older, stodgy organizations, and they haven't reacted to the fact they have a low level of talent. Pittsburgh is interesting. I think Pittsburgh's in a tough situation because they've had so much success with Roethlisberger. I mean, Tomlin's never had a losing season. So at a certain point, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I think they may be getting to the point where it is broke. They got to fix it. Tennessee, I think it's just because they have Derrick Henry, right? If you got a guy like Derrick Henry, you'll
have some level of success,
Yeah, and analytics be darned. You're just giving him the football, right? I mean, that's.
And I think outside of Pittsburgh, what we could say about those other four teams, Washington, Tennessee, Cincinnati, and New York, not known for great front offices.
No, and I'd agree with that 100%. And not only not known for great front offices, but not known for great coaching staffs either, right? I mean, when's the last time since Coughlin, in New York? Cincinnati's gone through a number of coaches. Rivera seems to be doing okay in Washington, but
they've
jury's
had
still out.
Multiple coaches ever since the 90s. They've had a carousel, so to speak. So
oh yeah. So I think that plays a role, right? If you don't have a good organization up top and you're not stable in the coach, I think that kind of shines to light some of the things you're talking about. You're not taking advantage of some of the tools that can be available to you.
And I think so. Very quick summary. What we have noticed, and through all of this information, using analytics can help boost a team to be a great team. Not using analytics can really hinder your team and can make teams that are great subpar at times. So I think it's very beneficial. And like you said, this is the future of football. In some capacity, using analytics-based decision-making is going to be the future of football.